Hello everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today we are going to be taking a deep dive into IP / packaged books / ghostwriting / licensed content. This is a huge topic that I'm covering because I have seen a lot of confusion about it, and admittedly, I was kind of confused about it until I learned more. I've seen especially some misinformation about what this is and what it means here on YouTube. So I'm going to illuminate this mysterious area of publishing. So essentially, IP means intellectual property, and IP in publishing, used as a shorthand, is when a writer is hired to write someone else's idea. So the intellectual property, the IP, doesn't belong to the author. It belongs to the publisher or to a book packager or to another party. I'm going to be defining more of what each of these things means and all the different ways in which an author can essentially write for hire, and the nuances to each of them, the pros and cons of each of them, so you can consider them for your career, as well as contrasting these things to ghostwriting. This is actually where I've seen confusion and misinformation. I've seen people equate IP or packaged books with ghostwriting, and they are not the same, usually. So let's get right into it. It's gonna be kind of a long video, I'm gonna warn you ahead of time, because as I was kind of developing my outline for this, I kept growing. It is 3 pages long because this is such a complex and interesting area of publishing. So first of all, just to let you know, in many cases, the books that you pick up to read, those were not the original ideas of the authors. The authors were hired to write them by third parties. There are some very famous books that are IP. Some of them are going to be more obvious to you, such as any of the Star Wars books that are coming out, or Marvel books, or so on. Of course, the authors don't own that intellectual property. They are hired by the company to write them for the publisher, or sometimes they're hired by the publisher if the publisher owns the IP, like Disney owns Marvel or its Disney princesses. There are also the big famous ones that are packaged books, such as like Gossip Girl, Pretty Little Liars. Those are both by Alloy, which we are going to talk about. But I think that people, even if they're aware of this, don't realize how prevalent it is, and specifically how being open to IP, working on IP projects or with packagers, can be vital in sustaining or even sometimes launching a writer's career. I do encourage any person who's interested in being a career author to keep their mind open about their publishing options and working on some of these projects. They come with pros and cons, and some of those pros and cons might surprise you. So IP has been on the rise in Kidlit, I have noticed. I've noticed that a lot of Disney Publishing's announced projects are IP. They are books for their own properties that they own, and they are hiring these authors. I know some of the authors auditioning for or being hired for these projects. I've also seen the rise of IP that you certainly don't know as IP. So there's certain publishers who I know are coming up with the ideas and hiring writers, and unless you know the authors in question, you would never know that that book was IP unless you went looking for it. There are ways to tell. And then I've also seen the rise of book packagers who almost keep it a secret that a book is a packaged book. This is a phenomenon I've noticed with Alloy titles. Usually Alloy is super transparent about what their books are, but there have been a few almost literary award-winning books that were actually packaged books, and most people don't know that. So this is increasingly becoming a huge chunk of the publishing market. Why is this the case? Well, Kidlit is saturated, and publishing is a business that's always looking for, a sure thing, and I hesitate to call it that because nothing is a sure thing, but they're looking for a good bet. And IP and or packaged books are often very good bets because either the publisher's developing the IP themselves, and so they get the majority of the profit on the thing, and they have developed an IP because they think it's going to work very well in the market, or they work with a packager who specializes in creating hits. And so there's less risk in working with a book packager because they're essentially buying something that has higher odds of being a huge success. Another reason there's been a rise in packagers is that there are now packagers who are really attuned to and great at finding fresh, new, diverse voices and coming up with culturally specific and authentic book ideas. And publishers are looking to publish more of those stories. And so these packagers are offering really good opportunities. They're bringing to the table great book ideas and excellent writers the publishers might not have otherwise found themselves. So let's dive right in, starting with IP, or what you're going to hear referred to as IP, even though IP can also refer to all of this. Confusing, right? So for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to talk about IP as when a publisher comes up with an idea in-house and then hires a writer to write it. This is less common than some of the other things we're going to talk about, but it is picking up in popularity, as I mentioned. Some publishers that I know are doing a lot of this include Simon & Schuster and Scholastic. In this case, the editor / the publisher comes up with a pitch, an idea, a book that they would like to publish. Then they reach out to agents and ask if they have any authors who would like to audition for the part, essentially, audition for the job. Part of the writer's audition is to develop the idea or the pitch and make it their own. So there's definitely a bit of collaboration involved, and the writer is able to bring a lot of themselves to the book, story / project. They would develop the outline and turn in sample chapters. If the writer is hired, the writer is paid a traditional book advance. They're paid in advance just like they would otherwise. Generally, though, that advance is going to be smaller because this is an IP project, but you're still getting paid. Sometimes in this case, the writer is going to get the copyright, and in some cases, the publisher is going to get the copyright on the book. I looked up a few examples that I knew were IP, and I saw examples of both. So, some notable examples of IP. When Dimple Met Rishi from Simon & Schuster. This is a great example where an editor had an idea, they hired a great writer who made the idea their own, Sandhya Menon. Sandhya has the copyright because it's essentially her idea, but Sandhya is very open about the process of how the book came about and that it was her editor who initially said, "I want a book like this," and then Sandhya auditioned for it. And then I have several examples from Scholastic, but the thing is, I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about them. And this becomes kind of the hitch of IP. Sometimes it's meant to kind of be a secret. It's not meant to be public that the publisher came up with the idea and then hired writers. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter to the readers. Either way, you're getting a great book that was, for the most part, developed by the author. So When Dimple Met Rishi is really the best example I have that I feel that I can share, but just know, Scholastic has a bunch. Because I know the people who are hired to write them. So, publishing. So what are the pros and cons of IP, being hired directly by a publisher to write a book? So the pro is obviously a guaranteed book deal. If you're hired to write the book, hey, you got a book deal. This works well for a lot of debuts. They do an IP project and it's a great way to break out on their first book. Also, I mentioned as a pro, it is a little bit more collaborative. The publisher tends not to be like, this is the book you must write. They have an idea for a book, and part of auditioning and hiring a specific writer to write it is they want that writer to develop it as their own. So it's still your book, it just wasn't your idea initially, and your editor does have a higher level of input than they would normally. Because, I mean, you're essentially writing the book after it's sold, so you're writing it on spec. So the cons, you are generally paid less, as I mentioned, but if your book blows up, then you have leverage for subsequent work with that publisher, so pros and cons. And then the other con is, well, it wasn't really your idea. Some of us are very precious about kind of our own ideas and our own intellectual property, so if that's going to bother you, it might not be the best fit. In general, none of this might be the best fit if that is something that bugs you, if you really only want to develop and write your own ideas. And then you can kind of lump it in under con or potentially under pro, and that is the secrecy. There is a bit more secrecy around IP that the publisher develops that isn't obviously IP because it's not brand developed IP, which we are going to talk about in a separate section. And you know, that could either rub you the right way or the wrong way. People might not even know that it wasn't originally your idea, so that could turn a con into a pro. So I do think the secrecy is worth considering. Oh, and something else I should mention in pro, and this is the case for a lot of these categories under IP packaged books. A huge pro can be, well, it's the jumpstarting a debut career, as I mentioned, but also IP can be a really good option for an author who has already debuted, who has maybe had a few books, who has struggled to sell subsequent work. It can be a really great career re-jumpstart. It can like shock new life into your career. It's writing for money, it's work. So IP can be really, really great for a mid-career author. Next is book packagers, and this is a whole other category because these are third-party businesses. These are standalone businesses whose sole function is to come up with big book and multimedia ideas. Most packagers, it's not just that they're developing books that can be turned into movies and TV shows. They're developing highly commercial media properties. So the biggest packager that you're definitely going to know that I already mentioned is Alloy Entertainment. They're behind some of those properties I already mentioned, such as Gossip Girl, Pretty Little Liars. They also did The 100 and so many more. Other ones that you should know are Glasstown Entertainment. This is a packager run by Lauren Oliver and Lexa Hillier, as well as Cake Literary, which is run by Sona Chirapotra and Danielle Clayton. Cake is one of the ones that I mentioned that has become a fantastic incubator for culturally specific and authentic middle grade and YA books written by Own Voices writers. It's been so great to see Danielle and Sona develop fresh new talent for the industry. Cake is definitely one to watch. So how does it work with a packager? So the packager packages and delivers a book to a publisher. They come up with the idea. They come up with most of the outline. There's less creative freedom when you're working with a packager, though it does vary by packager. Some give the author more creative freedom than others. They come up with this idea and then they audition a bunch of writers for that idea. Typically, you're going to have more competition when you're going up for a package book deal versus IP. Publishers tend to only approach a few writers, whereas packagers are going to look at a broader spectrum of writer. They want to find the ideal, perfect writer for the project, and packagers essentially have their pick because they control the whole thing. And that is the thing. If you work with a packager, you become a part of a product. You are part of what they are delivering to publishers. So if you get hired, you will work on fleshing out the outline with them. They're not, asking you to like chain yourself to a typewriter and write exactly what they want. There is some collaboration that does go on with a packager. As I mentioned, some more collaboration with some than others. And then you would write sample chapters, and the packager, usually with an in-house agent connection or their own connections, will submit the book for you to publishers. So you can work with a packager even if you don't have your own literary agent. I do recommend you have a literary agent if you are going to get into the packaged book business, though not everyone shares those feelings. A lot of the writers who work with Alloy, for example, don't have agents. They just work directly with Alloy. So just kind of bear that in mind. We'll talk about this a bit more under pros and cons. So they submit your book. If it sells, then you have to write the whole book. I can share just from some of my knowledge and experiences with Alloy, Glasstown, and Cake, some variations. So Alloy obviously being the big guy on the block who's been doing this for decades. They have an idea, they audition a ton of writers, then they fly you to New York. You develop the outline with them, but it's definitely an Alloy book. You have your own editor that you work with, and you basically work with them as an editor, and then you sell a book and you work with that editor. You end up having two editors anytime you work with a book packager. Glasstown and Cake are a little bit more holistic. I do know this because I have personal connections to both of those packagers. In those cases, they're going more for nurturing talent and coming up with book packages that work really well for those talents, and then they go on submission with them to publishers. So you can audition for Glasstown and for Cake, not on a necessarily project basis. You can just send them your material so that you can be considered for future work. And sometimes if they really like your sample and they like who you are, they will specifically develop a project with you in mind. I can also confirm Glasstown and Cake both have literary agents who submit their work and do all of their kind of literary contracty agency stuff, and then Alloy submits everything on their own because they're very experienced at this. They don't use the literary agent specifically, they're Alloy. So as I mentioned, publishers really like working with book packagers because they're basically delivering very often a sure thing. Packagers often are making these book deals for 6 figures, like these are big deals, and you'll hear about a lot of them. They're high concept, splashy hooks, and those books very often end up being bestsellers. Not always, but often. So the packager can be a great way to get you a great book deal that's gonna get you a lot of buzz, you'll get a lot of marketing support if it was a big deal, but they're not going to protect you in the same way that an agent does. You're working together on the book and you have the shared interest of the book, but this is honestly why I do recommend having an agent even if you're working with a packager, because you want an agent to protect your interest with the publisher. That's just like a piece of advice from me. And it can go both ways. You can have an agent and audition for a packager, or you cannot have an agent audition for a packager, get a package deal, and then get an agent. There are lots of different ways to do it. And honestly, I've noticed increasingly agented authors who are working with packagers, either to jumpstart a debut career or to kind of revive kind of a mid-career. Just the same as with IP, working with a packager can be a great shot in the arm to your career. Now, let's talk about money. So you are essentially paid by the packager, not the publisher, because the packager is the one selling the book. Some packagers do flat rate, which is very similar to work for hire if you're doing a different kind of IP, licensed IP, which we're getting to in a minute, or ghostwriting, but some do scale. They'll give you a percentage of the sale. Scale percentage is in a writer's best interest better than flat, because what if you're paid flat and then they sell it for a butt ton of money? You kind of get screwed over, which is again why I think you should have an agent if you're working with a packager, because they can negotiate in your best interest. But then you're splitting the percentage with your agent. So these are all things you have to bear in mind when you're going into packaging as a business decision. I can tell you anecdotally that I have heard that 30% is kind of a base percentage that you should expect from a packager. Obviously, if you have a good agent or you have personal leverage from your own career, you're gonna wanna negotiate that up. But that is my personal advice to you. I think percentage is better than flat, and it's good to have a representative so that you can negotiate for that percentage. Percentage is also good because if the book blows up, you should get a percentage of royalties. The thing with packaging is you want to protect yourself as the writer. There are definitely situations where the writer can be taken advantage of, so just get as much information as you can, do your research, and don't sign a bad contract because you're desperate to publish. So what are the pros of working with a packager? So first of all, they usually do huge book deals. Alloy, for example, always goes for major deals, which is $500,000 or more. That is what they specialize in. It's their bread and butter. Huge, big book deals. Also, very often these packaged books do end up being bestsellers. You're not only getting marketing support and buzz from your publisher, but the packager will often do their own work. Alloy specifically tries to get film and TV deals for all of its projects. So like with The 100, that started as a book simultaneous to a TV deal, and well, you see what happened there. Working with a packager, as I said, can be a great way to get your foot in the door as a debut or to revive a career if you're more mid-career. Especially if you had a lackluster debut, going with a packager for your next book can completely turn your career around because it is in the packager's best interest to push your book and to push your publisher to push your book in marketing. So what are the cons? Well, first of all, you're working for someone else. You are work for hire. It's not your idea. You have some input, but ultimately the packager has final say of what you're doing, but then so does your editor when you sell it to the publisher. There are a lot more cooks in the kitchen when you're working with a book packager. But I will throw in a belated pro. If you like working off of other people's ideas and brainstorming with other people and collaborative writing experiences, you might really enjoy this process. Packagers are basically story experts. They're there to support you and help you write the best book possible. The next con is that you don't own the IP. Packagers own the copyright for these books. They also get the lion's share of everything. So if these things blow up, like as a movie or TV, they get most of everything. Now the thing is, a percentage of something huge can be a lot. So you're definitely taking that gamble of, well, what if it's a breakout bestseller with a hugely successful TV show? You can do pretty well on that. So you always have to kind of measure the pros and cons there. Another con, of course, is that it's very competitive, especially at Alloy. You might be auditioning against 30 other writers. So it's a con in the sense that you can put in work on an audition and end up not getting it. You can be disappointed. It can be a process to get your foot in the door of packagers. And I'll tell you anecdotally, a lot of the people who end up writing for Alloy and breaking out with Alloy were either editors at Alloy or otherwise work in the publishing business. That's definitely something I've noticed. It's not that easy to get your foot in the door with Alloy. And then the last con is about that flat versus scale. If you're paid a flat fee and then they sell your book for $500,000, wow, you kind of get screwed over. So that's definitely a con, that you're kind of taking that gamble in terms of negotiating the pay. Another con of packaged books is you usually have to turn around the drafts really fast. Once they sell, you need to write the book in 3 to 4 months in some cases. This is going to vary by packager, but be aware that because you are being sold on proposal, that once it sells, you're going to have to turn around a book on a pretty tight timeline. So this doesn't always work for all writers. If you're not a particularly fast writer, working with packagers might not be the best fit. Now, just some quick examples of packaged books. So I already mentioned some of the big Alloy ones, but also Everything Everything was an Alloy book, as was If I Was Your Girl, and they recently released Pride. So you'd be surprised what books are packaged, and in a lot of these cases, you can tell that the author had a lot of influence on the book. So it's not always the case where like you don't have control. Packaged writing can really be a collaborative process and a great way to break out your career. I mean, Everything. Huge, right? And then examples from Glasstown. Everlist, which came out earlier this year, was a bestseller. That is a Glasstown book, and they have a bunch of announced books that will be coming out over the next couple of years that are very exciting as well. I pay attention to deal announcements. They have some really juicy fantasies coming out. Then Cake Literary. Cake Literary did The Gauntlet by Karuna Riazi, a really successful middle grade that came out last year. Tristan Strong Punches a Hole Through the Sky, which is a Rick Riordan Presents book by Kwame Mbalia. Really excited about that one. And many more. Cake's sweet spot so far is definitely middle grade, but they are expanding more into YA as well. Whew. Next is licensed content, which also sometimes is referred to by the shorthand IP, but is like a separate part of IP because publishing is confusing. So licensed content. This is IP that is owned by major brands. And so the brands develop the book projects and then hire writers to write them. These are the ones that are going to be pretty familiar to you. So the DC books, like the Wonder Woman book that Leigh Bardugo wrote, the Catwoman book by Sarah J. Maas, the Batman book by Marie Lu, any Marvel tie-ins that you're seeing published by Disney, Disney Princess books published by Disney, and then all of the Star Wars books. They've been doing a ton of those. These are all licensed content / IP. Now, anecdotally offhand, it's almost like you're being paid to write fan fiction, because you are essentially writing books that exist within the worlds of these media properties, and the brand owners are pretty specific about what they want from these books and what you are allowed to and not allowed to write. So in this category, you're going to have the least creative freedom usually, but the payoffs can be really, really good. So licensed content deals can be lucrative and career changing, but they're also more creatively rigid. They're also the hardest to get. So you definitely need to have an agent to be considered for this. Much like IP where a publisher approaches agents, it's the same thing with licensed content. The brand owners are going to approach key literary agents or even sometimes talk to the publisher and see who they recommend, and they're going to recommend authors. These are going to be established authors. This isn't a case where you're necessarily going to get your foot in the door as a debut. The licensed content ones are looking for proven track record as an author. Now, what they want from them varies. Sometimes they want you to already be established and pretty big. Other times they want you to just have a niche fan base and respect in what you write. It totally differs. And I should say, they're not going to hire a debut to write Star Wars, Marvel, and so on. But Disney princesses are different, like Disney publishing properties. This is so confusing, but you do need an agent to go up for these jobs. Now, when you're auditioning, you're not fleshing out the idea and creating the outline like you would with some of these other options. You're writing to spec. They're telling you what they want, and you would audition with sample chapters. Then, if you're chosen, you have to write the book on a pretty tight deadline. I've heard of deadlines of like 8 weeks to turn around one of these licensed content books, so be aware. This is really for leveled up writers who have a pretty firm grasp on writing quickly and writing well to spec. Now, admittedly, I know the least about licensed content in terms of money and how that kind of stuff works because I don't have as many personal connections who have worked on licensed content, but I'm pretty sure from what I've heard that you get flat fee. You are a writer for hire. Flat fee is more common with writer for hire. So unlike with packaged books where it's like, oh, I got a low flat fee and then they sold it for a ton of money, I feel screwed over. You don't get to have those feelings with licensed content because with licensed content, you usually feel so lucky to be able to write for them that you take whatever they'll pay you and then they go off and do their own thing. Which brings me to one of the huge pros is that you can become a breakout bestseller because Star Wars books are almost always bestsellers. The DC YA books were all bestsellers. Now, they were written by bestsellers, so that's a case where it's kind of chicken and egg. But same thing, you know, with some of the Disney books, the publishers and brands have a vested interest in making these books huge sellers, but also they have built-in fandoms. So the built-in fandoms will buy the books. So that can be a huge pro. You can be a best-selling author. The content owners and brands also put major push behind them. They might send you on a book tour to major fan conventions. You just get to do some really cool stuff when you work on licensed content. And if it's IP that you love, you're essentially being paid to write fan fiction, and that's pretty cool. Writing licensed content can be a true dream come true for many, many writers. So I already mentioned you gotta write these books really, really fast. You also have limited creative control because the brands have certain ideas like the character must be portrayed in this way because it fits kind of brand and we can't go against brand standards, or ooh, you have to do the plot and the character development like this because it has to fit in with the canon of the next movie. So there's a lot more restriction when it comes to the actual creative process and what you are allowed to write. Another potential con is that I have heard from authors who have done these that even though they're bestsellers and huge with the IP, it doesn't necessarily translate over to the rest of their book sales. The general rule of thumb is that frontlist sells backlist, but when you do licensed content, that isn't necessarily true. If you write a Star Wars book, that doesn't mean they're going to pick up your YA fantasy, is what I'm trying to say. I've heard mixed reports on what this does for a career overall in terms of backlist and original work. Whew, which brings me to ghostwriting, which is really not IP. It's really nothing like IP or packaged books or licensed content, but I want to talk about it because I have noticed some serious misconceptions. I've seen people conflate ghostwriting with working with a packager or doing licensed content or doing IP with a publisher. And the thing is, they're different. They're definitely different. The biggest difference is when you're hired as a ghostwriter, it's in the title, you're a ghost. 95% of the time you're not going to get credit. You are being hired to write something so that someone else can take credit for your work. Most often you're ghostwriting for a celebrity. This is a pretty common thing. Most of us are aware of it, but I think I've seen a lot, especially on YouTube and AuthorTube, people talking about evil publishing, the perils of publishing. They'll bring up ghostwriting and I'm like, but that is such a rare thing. Most people don't ghostwrite, and so they don't have a case where Zoella takes credit for their book. But sometimes with ghostwriting you do get credit. You'll get like a so-and-so with, and then they'll put your name on the cover. It totally depends on the project, the person involved, and how comfortable they are with sharing credit, as well as kind of your chops as a ghostwriter or who you work for as a ghostwriter. So if you want to do ghostwriting, we'll just jump into pros. So a major pro of ghostwriting potentially as a career writer is you can be a career writer. Ghostwriting is a way to pay the bills, to write consistently, to make money off of it, and to stay in the business. I know a couple of working ghostwriters. They've also published original work, so to speak, under their own name, but ghostwriting pays the bills. They've written celebrity memoirs and self-help books and occasionally a novel for, again, usually like a reality TV person. It pays the bills. Especially if you are a fast commercial writer, you write well to spec, ghostwriting can be a really great option. You're usually paid flat fee because this is work for hire, but you go in knowing that. You're not expecting scale, you're not expecting credit. It's a job. You do your job and you move on. Another pro is these books might actually in many ways be easier to write because in many cases you're translating a story for another person. You're writing the memoir of a celebrity. They're telling you stuff and you just make it sound pretty. Or it's some media darling who wants to write a YA book and they come up with half-baked ideas and you string it together and make it sound pretty good. And the thing is, your name's not going to be on it, so it's not like it has to be a masterpiece. Like, ghostwriting, again, can be a great way to pay the bills and to be a working writer. But cons, you rarely get credited for your work. Sometimes you're gonna write books you're really not proud of, but at least no one knows it was you. So that's again a pro. If you do get paid a flat fee and your name isn't on something and it does blow up, that can be a huge bummer. I do know someone who wrote a bestseller that was turned into a TV show and they get no credit for anything. Curses, but that is the name of the game. It can be thankless, mind-numbing work, but again, it pays the bills. But again, I want to stress, ghostwriting is not the same as IP, licensed content, or packaged books. In all of those cases, in 99% of the case, your name is gonna be on the book. This is your book publicly. There are cases where packagers do hire ghostwriters. This happens with established series like things like Sweet Valley High were definitely written by ghostwriters, The Babysitter's Club, definitely written by ghostwriters, but that is kind of a whole other thing and it's less common now. So, overall pros and cons of IP, licensed content, working with a packager. Pro number one is that IP rewards fast writers. If you can churn out multiple books a year, IP can work really, really well for you. You can get paid consistently for writing books fast. IP is also potentially good for those of you who thrive off of collaborative storytelling, brainstorming, and writing to spec, writing what other people are telling you to write. If you write clean and fast, you can have a great career. Another pro, it's a solid way to break into publishing, as I mentioned, or a solid way to jumpstart a career that was kind of flagging. Another pro, as I mentioned, in a lot of these cases, you might end up a bestseller. It's definitely a gamble that you take, but it's pretty good odds depending on the packager or the IP or the licensed content. And finally, it keeps you writing and employed. IP and licensed content and packaged books is really something to think about if you want to be a career writer. So many of the authors that you know who stick around, who thrive, do these projects. You might not always know that they're doing these projects, but this is how they get food on the table and they keep their careers going. And then the cons again, usually there's really fast turnaround. You can get less money, less glory. There's also stigma on IP, though I think the stigma is becoming less, especially with some of these secret packaged projects. But there's the stigma on like, oh, it's not your idea. And sometimes people don't take you as seriously, but are you laughing all the way to the bank? That is the question. And there's less creative freedom. And as I mentioned, in some cases you can get screwed over money-wise, but I think the key is to be smart going in, understand the mechanics of IP, and have a good agent. Seriously, having a good agent protects you on so many of these fronts. Even if it means you get less money because you are splitting earnings, I think that your agent earns their 15%. So is IP right for you? I recommend it for authors who are fast, who are flexible, who aren't too precious about their own ideas, who work really well collaboratively, who are looking for a breakout moment, whether as a debut or as a mid-career writer. Especially if you've been trying to debut and you've been struggling to get an agent or to get a book deal, you've gone on submission with things. IP can offer a really attractive opportunity, and I know authors who are pursuing IP projects because of that very situation. I also personally know authors who did have disappointing debuts, and then they had a huge hit working with a packager, and they're really, really happy working with that packager and doing that work. It just works for some writers. Generally, I just want to share that IP might not be right for you now, but it doesn't mean it won't always be right for you. I think that as writers, we should be really open-minded about our career trajectory and our options. IP is definitely something I would consider in the long term, though my biggest hang-up personally is that I'm not a very fast writer. So for me, I'd have to overcome that obstacle personally. But a lot about IP is attractive. I love the collaborative storytelling. It's really attractive, the potential to break out. And honestly, I just love some of the ideas that publishers and packagers come up with. And if the right brand came along, being paid to write fan fiction sounds really great. So that is your download on IP. What is it? When you hear it thrown around, what does IP mean? What are book packagers, etc. and so on. Whew, I am exhausted after talking about all that. This was a very complex topic. There's even more to talk about. There's certain nuances. I mean, working with a packager alone is so different from working in licensed content, which is very different from working direct with a publisher. But I hope that I was able to provide kind of a top-line view of what each one is and some of the pros and cons of the different types. Let me know down below in the comments if you have any questions. This is a huge topic and I could have talked even longer about it, but I'm gonna stop now. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and I will make more deep dives into the publishing industry. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.